and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to be talking about electrification, and particularly electrification related to consumer products. In today's session, we're going to focus on many different facets that relate to electrification for consumer products and how companies developing these products can find opportunities for growth through examining a wide range of different insights and trends, looking at consumer insights, regulatory trends, technology developments, and end-of-life options. My name is Jeff Cope. I'm a senior director here at RTI Innovation Advisors. I'll be your moderator for today's session. My colleague, Taylor Moot, will be leading the presentation, and I'll introduce you to her in just a moment. Here's the plan for today. I'll kick us off with a couple slides about RTI so that you have a sense for who we are and the types of work that we do in this space. Taylor's going to lead us through the main material for today's session, and then we'll have a brief Q&A session at the end. In that Q&A session, we're going to answer some of the questions that were provided to us in advance. Thank you for those. And any questions that come up during the session. So please use that Q&A function in the webinar, share those questions with us, and we will allocate some time at the end to address those as best we can. So let's get started. Let me start with, next slide, please, Shane. Let's start with a quick snapshot of who we are. RTI International is a global, independent, nonprofit research institute dedicated to improving the human condition. We have 6,000 people deployed all around the world, and we conduct over $1.2 billion in contract research services on an annual basis. Taylor and I are part of an innovation and sustainability consultancy within the Institute called RTI Innovation Advisors. We help organizations, think large companies, federal agencies, universities, foundations. We help these organizations innovate to shape a better future. We do that by conducting custom research and advisory projects that help turn insights into new strategies, new products, new services, or technologies that can have a meaningful human and business impact. As you'll see today, electrification is a very complex space to navigate. And so it's a great example of the type of work that we do, helping clients stay abreast of emerging technology developments in batteries and motors and sensors, helping build strategies for interpreting regulatory trends, understanding consumer perceptions toward adoption, and other main drivers and influence of change. Next slide. Our perspective on innovation and sustainability is always grounded in science and data, as well as in the rich real-world experience that we gain through thousands of engagements with clients across different sectors and industries. Through this body of work, we have a lot of experience with today's topic, but you can see that we also work extensively across the sustainability spectrum to empower our clients to find answers to complex technical and strategic challenges, and to help them build more innovative, resilient, sustainable futures. Next slide, please. We have a number of experts at RTI working across electrification and decarbonization related challenges. We have a few of those experts highlighted here on the slide, and I'm really excited that we have Taylor Moot with us today to walk us through this fascinating topic. Let me introduce you to Taylor. Taylor Moot is an innovation advisor with a focus on electrification, sustainable energy, and decarbonization. Leveraging nearly a decade of experience in new technology research, development, and deployment, Taylor primarily focuses on accelerating market penetration for emerging technologies by uncovering fit-for-purpose market opportunities. With growing global interest in electrification, Taylor helps clients understand the trends and forces influencing adoption of consumer products, and she identifies relevant battery advances for clients' products. Prior to joining us here at RTI, Taylor worked as a product manager at a startup, was a postdoctoral researcher at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and received her PhD in materials chemistry from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Taylor, thank you for being with us today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. And Jeff, thanks for the kind introduction. Let's move on to the next slide and get into the weeds of what we're here to talk about. So here we really want to talk about electrification and how it can, this mega trend of electrification, how can it be influencing or impacting consumer products? But first, let's set some context of what are we even talking about? So first, what's the challenge? What's the problem that we kind of are interested in solving? That is that residential greenhouse gas emissions, including both direct emissions from your house, as well as those indirect emissions that are produced when generating electric power for your house. All of that, when you add to get together, accounts for about 20% of total US greenhouse gas emissions, which is quite a lot. That's not a small percentage. To tackle these challenges, there's a bunch of different approaches and technology solutions that have been developed. We have just a handful of those on the slide here. And then these can range from energy efficiency solutions such as LEDs, smart thermostats, and other energy efficient appliances. Others are more so focused on electrifying existing equipment that typically runs on gas, such as electric vehicles, electric lawn equipment, induction stoves, and heat pumps. The last bucket is products that actually produce or store energy, and those are really your rooftop solar and backup batteries. Across all of these categories, we see technologies that have been around for a while and have been integrated into homes for a long time, as well as ones that are becoming new and consumers are really interested in today. A fun fact that I always like to share is that LEDs now account for over 50% of global residential lighting sales. And if you are perhaps like me, you remember when LEDs were very expensive and novel. So it's been very cool to see within my lifetime of actually buying things for my own house, this has changed. Next slide, please. So today, this is a huge world. Electrification, home electrification is a massive space. Today, really what we want to focus on is what does this all mean? What does this mega trend of electrification matter to the folks that were hopefully attending this webinar today? How can this massive electrification trend impact consumer goods just beyond the ones that I just mentioned? And what does it mean for those individual product groups that I have listed at the bottom? Consumer electronics, small appliances, power tools, electric lawn equipment, and things around the e-mobility and that micro-mobility space. We want to understand kind of how, as we see battery advancements driven by all of these topics that I talked about before, how can those be used or co-opted for these types of products here that we've listed today? Next slide, please. To begin to grapple with and answer these complex questions about the direct or indirect impacts of electrification on those product groups I just talked about, we like to use holistic frameworks such as STEEP. So STEEP stands for social, technological, environmental, economic, and political. And it really helps us ensure that we're thinking through the full set of drivers and barriers of change that are considered. Because new technology, when it's being adopted, it depends on all of these, and these are often interconnected, right? You're probably having political and economic talking to each other, environmental and social are interconnected, as well as honestly all of them together. So this is kind of how we like to set ourselves in the right situation to make sure that we're thinking thoughtfully about all these different facets as well as how they're connected. So to do that, we start to ask questions such as what regulations and policies are relevant and how may they impact product adoption. Then we ask things like what trends and forces are driving consumer behavior? What are those new technologies and advancements that exist that can be deployed today as well as in the future? And then how are those macroeconomic forces impacting outcomes? And last, but definitely not least, what do I need to consider to make sure my product truly is sustainable and is seen as sustainable? You know, each of these topics could certainly take an entire webinar on their own. So we're going to try to focus on some key takeaways from each and use this framework as a guide to the conversation about electrification. We're going to go through a lot of content, so be prepared, but please put any questions you have in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer them towards the session at the end. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get into it. I think we first want to start with social and really delve into understanding what is driving that consumer behavior. Because as we're thinking about consumer products, this is obviously one of the key questions we want to start with. While this is a global trend, we're really going to mostly focus on the US today, just given kind of simplifying the conversation we want to have. So within the US, as well as I said globally, we're seeing increased interest in purchase of electrified homes. For example, About 7% of US homes have solar installed. Within the US, about 8% of cars purchased in 2023 were EVs, where we're seeing globally that's at about 18%. It's quite high, given how relatively new the technology is. And then when we think more globally, we see that even back in 2022, EVs accounted for 75% of two-wheelers. So that's your scooters, e-bikes, motorcycles purchased in China. So this is not day one of this. This has been moving for a while, and we're really kind of at this precipice of that innovators transitioning into early adopters, which is a super exciting spot to be. So we have the stats, we kind of get the idea, things are moving, but we want to know who are those customers and what is motivating them and why are they interested in electrifying? So there's a couple of ways we like to think about this, but first I'll talk through kind of the core component. So we like to think through these questions through the lens of how innovations diffuse through different consumer groups. You'll see that diffusion of innovation graph on the right. Thinking through what are those groups and what motivates them from the innovators, the early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. Here we have a few examples, really just backed by aggregated data of what are some characteristics that might exist for early adopters in the US, and that 13% of that population that's interested in trying these new products. This is really generic across electrification and not really specific to one particular product, but hopefully you kind of get the gist of how we think about this, as well as some of those higher level trends and motivators. So these folks that are early adopters, they tend to have high household incomes. For example, in 2023, almost 20% of all EVs purchased in the US came from households that had over 250K as their incomes, which is the highest bracket that we tend to look at. Additionally, they tend to have already begun to electrify their home. Again, in the US, households with solar panels are 80% more willing to try to electrify their water heaters. We even see that having an electric lawnmower can make a difference. Those households that have an electric lawnmower also are 30% more willing to try a water heater. Or sorry, an electric water heater, not just any water heater. The last part is that they're motivated by sustainability. So those customers that are currently looking at new products that could be electrified, such as electric cars, heat pumps, electric bikes, induction stoves, those types of things, they can be characterized as believing that collective solutions can solve complex systems problems. That is like one of their core values that they kind of can motivate purchases. Therefore, they generally tend to believe that they tend to value caring for the earth and therefore are more likely to be concerned and motivated by climate change. What we're seeing as well is sort of some of the characteristics emerge for that early majority section as well. That's nearly 1/3 of consumers. And what they're motivated by the US, or at least what those emerging signals are that we're seeing, is that one, they tend to be distributed across the US. They can live in rural communities, they live across all 50 states. Before and kind of that innovator early adopter phase, a lot of the folks that were electrifying were doing it in states or cities, smaller pockets that was tend to be driven by financial incentives through the state or local efforts, as well as ease of implementation, which can mean anything from can you actually connect your house? Can you put solar on your house based on rules with your utility, as well as access to EV chargers? All of those things make a difference. But what we're seeing now is that there's more folks across the US that are interested in this. So a stat that I always think is really interesting is if you look at this is very specific, but I do want to get it right. The retail investments of zero emission vehicles as a percentage of GDP by state. So like amount of money spent versus amount of money of the GDP by state. The purchasing of EVs is actually highest in Oklahoma at 0.87%, whereas California is at only 0.65%. Not really large numbers, but you start to see that if you look at states across different ways, you see that there are emerging areas that are very interested in electrifying their vehicles. Another interesting detail is that on a per capita basis, Alabama actually has the highest investment of heat pumps, and Maine has the highest investment of residential solar and backup battery systems. So when we start to look at this, we start to see that beyond the maybe states that you think of as first adopters, folks there are really interested in getting in on this trend. Second, they have a multitude of values that are motivating them to make these purchases. Some segments are certainly motivated by sustainability, as I talked about previously, but we're also seeing that consumers who are motivated by kind of clean and natural living, That is the desire to make sure their house is under control, safe, and clean from all kinds of threats and contaminants. They're increasingly seeing a value in home electrification as well. So we're really starting to see that broadening of interest. Next slide, please. All right, to delve a little bit deeper, again, that was very high level. And one of the things we like to do is we like to create a bit more of product specific personas to better understand that exact specific customer segment, those motivations and behaviors that they tend to have. I'm just going to run through this really quickly, but what we tend to do for these is we create them off of secondary research, interviews, survey data, and this is a very simplified version of what they would actually look like. But we like to include things such as age, income, leisure activities, history of electrification, future electrification plans. Again, while not shown here, we also tend to look at things like types of employments, worries and concerns about electrification, highest level of education, family size and format. All this can come together and really give us a lot more of a detailed understanding of what the motivations are across those segments, beyond kind of that higher level view that I showed before. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've talked a bit about who, and again, going fast, so add some questions if you have them. And now we want to dig into a little bit of the why and how. So why are consumers translating what are typically longer held beliefs into purchases today? And how are those larger macroeconomic forces and policies accelerating or in some cases hampering this? So again, mostly focusing on the US here. What we're seeing is that policies across the national, state, and local levels are being designed to increase electrification of households. So what we do is we like to think about how the political economy and that enabling environment can help characterize the likelihood of changes of practices and policies that could impact electrification. So here we like to think about, again, as I said, the national, regional, state, and city level, and then kind of understand how that works. For brevity, I'm just going to talk through a couple of examples. There's obviously a lot, and there's a lot of new news that we've had that will change this, and we can certainly talk about that in the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to, again, keep it pretty high level. So at the national level, I think many of you probably are aware of this one, the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA. It was passed in 2022, and it was one of the largest investments in energy and climate that the US has ever made. Includes a massive range of tax credit for consumers, including for EVs, residential solar, backup batteries, as well as residential energy efficiency measures, such as like better insulation, better insulated windows, those types of things. In 2023, or recently, the US Treasury released data for 2023 that showed that over 3.4 million families claimed over $8 billion in residential tax credits. The Northeast received the most for energy efficiency, and the Sun Belt, so Nevada, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Florida, took the most for that clean energy tax credit, so that solar on your roof kind of thing. In the US, states tend to have considerable power to set policy, and thus we can see that states can also have an outsized impact on incentivizing consumer purchasing behavior writ large, regardless of what products you're thinking about. All 50 states have some level of incentive or policy to promote the adoption of renewables and energy efficiency. The impact of which really can vary heavily state by state, depending on the specific products they target, such as energy efficient windows to solar to EVs, as well as the type of incentive. So some have free vehicle registration for EVs versus actual tax incentives to purchase a new product. All of that will impact how those consumers move through these. Last, cities are providing incentives and policies to promote electrification. Cities can provide those policies. Cities can often create policies and incentives faster than states can, and thus can be some of the first entities to, in fact, push for policies or incentives that drive these adoptions. And when we look, about 50% of cities within the US have net zero targets, either enacted or proposed. So this is a trend that we're seeing across all levels of government in the US. Next slide, please. So shifting gears a bit and kind of thinking about that political and economic components at a more global perspective, we certainly know that policies and incentives have impacts and implications beyond just consumer purchasing behaviors. What we're seeing is that there's been a lot of policies that have been driving manufacturing of batteries. So global manufacturing capacity for batteries has taken off recently. There are tons of gigafactories being announced, far outpacing the expected demand. So the Inflation Reduction Act has caused over 1,300 gigawatt hours of new battery production capacity to be announced just in the US. We're seeing that is when you add that together with everything that's happening in US, Canada, Europe, India, and China, adds up to nearly 8 terawatt hours of battery capacity manufacturing. And we're only expecting the demand for 2025, that same time frame, is closer to 1.6 terawatt hours. So a ton of extra capacity. And what that can end up meaning is that while not all of it will be built, of course, that extra capacity is going to start to drive down costs and squeeze margins. Already, we're seeing that Chinese battery manufacturers are announcing that they can sell batteries at below that $60 per kilowatt hour by the end of this year. Next slide, please. Okay, all of these are all of these non-technology factors have implications, but I do want to kind of shift to where we actually start, the actual battery technologies. So we kind of have walked through the who and the why. Now I want to talk about the what. What are the batteries that actually matter for the products that you all work on? So we're going to talk about four relatively mature technologies and not really the earlier technology readiness level batteries, although there are many exciting ones. Really just trying to focus on the ones that are soon to the market or ones that you can kind of access today. The other thing to point out is that these four technologies do a really good job of demonstrating that battery technologies are really not one size fit all. Choosing the right battery technology for your product is going to vary significantly by the product size, scale, what the demands of the consumer are, power demands, safety concerns, cost sensitivities, all those things. Okay, these are kind of aggregated in larger buckets, but there's obviously nuance within these, but I'm going to kind of just keep it at the high level. First, lithium-ion batteries. These are commercially available. You probably have products in them that are using them, your computer, for example. They're available at the large scale and are used, across everything. This in our bucket is going to cover the different cathodes as LFP, NMC, all of that. And given their global scale, they are by far the cheapest batteries on the market to date, although safety can sometimes be a concern depending on where you're using it. Next, sodium-ion batteries. These are batteries where the lithium is replaced by the sodium, and that replacement has two important effects. One, because it doesn't have lithium, which is a flammable material, they tend to be much safer. Two, they tend to be much cheaper. Even though they're not being manufactured at the scale of lithium ion, they're expected to reach cost parity around 2025 or 2026. I mean, that really is because that sodium that you're using instead of lithium is much cheaper. The drawback of those is that the energy densities tend to be slightly lower than lithium ion. And so they're currently being looked at for options to be used as large scale battery storage for grids and those kinds of things. But others are looking at them for consumer products as well. Silicon batteries are similar to sodium batteries in terms of their stage of development, but they have ample prototypes and manufacturing facilities that are being built today. Here, instead of modifying the cathode, silicon batteries are replacing the graphite anode with silicon in order to give them higher energy densities, about double, almost double that of some of the lithium-ion batteries. These also tend to have a better ability to produce power under load rather than lithium-ion batteries, and because of that, they're looked at for certain kind of high power requirement applications. The one thing is because they have a high energy density, they also have safety concerns similar to lithium ion. And then last is the ever elusive solid state batteries. They've been on the cusp of prototypes and manufacturing for years, but they really still are in that advanced R&D stage. We see a lot of announcements around large scale implementation of solid state batteries that are always a couple years out. And so we're kind of imagining that those are closer to 2030. Those tend to be safe as well as have really high energy densities, which is why they're kind of the holy grail. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we think about kind of what's going on, even though sodium batteries, silicon batteries, and solid state batteries are not really widely available, we're already seeing examples of consumer product brands announcing partnerships or for future product launches with these new battery technologies. So for silicon, we're seeing this across consumer electronics, small household appliances, power tools, and e-mobility. They're all thinking about silicon batteries to take advantage of that high energy density to help to help decrease the product side, improve battery life, and or that power demand. So for example, Whoop, the fitness tracker band is working with Sila Nanotechnology sodium ion batteries for their new fitness tracker, enabling them to use smaller wearables while also enabling additional features around health monitoring. For solid state batteries, many companies in consumer electronics, home appliances, and e-mobilities have made announcements over the years about plans to integrate solid state batteries into their products. Although we don't have great examples of success quite yet. The one thing we do want to call out is that the Swiss e-bike company Stormer has released a prototype that uses solid state batteries to increase the safety and enable fast charging. Last is sodium ion. Like I said before, it really is focused kind of on achieving the market within grid backup storage, but we are seeing that it is being explored in some of that lighter equipment. So we're seeing partnerships with United Airlines to trial sodium ion batteries to electrify airport ground transportation, as well as electric forklifts on the smaller scale. So we'll see how that works and kind of if that is a good fit. So while these product categories might not be directly relevant to what you're focused on, what we really find is that looking closely at what's happening across adjacent industries or product categories can provide those useful insights into potential technology solutions that could be right for your product, maybe closer to tomorrow rather than today. And so that's why we like to highlight these and kind of watch these spaces. Next slide, please. So battery chemistry gets a lot of attention, and as a chemist, it is my favorite part to think about, I will not lie. But it is one component that impacts the performance of electric or battery-powered equipment. And it is really important to consider innovations across the entire product design itself. So this can include things like battery management systems, heat management, charger design, battery pack design, wireless charging, as well as hot swapping. So just to kind of highlight a few of these and what's going on. I think heat management comes up a lot because it is one of the biggest challenges for fast charging and kind of continued use. Um, Products are being designed to dissipate heat either through the material choice within the battery package itself or the use of fans integrated into the product design itself. And brands such as Grainger are really looking at this for power tools. And so we are seeing that things beyond the battery are being considered for as core innovations in these new products. Next slide, please. So again, fast and furious through the technology, ask questions if you have them. But what we want to spend a little bit more time on is thinking about the environmental component. Batteries themselves can enable so much amazing opportunities in terms of new product development, new product design, consumer enjoyment, as well as helping to decarbonize products. But without that environmental component, we want to always make sure that we're designing things thoughtfully and carefully such that our aspirations for sustainability are carried through the entire way. So for batteries and battery equipment, of course, there's a lot of concerns such as mineral sourcing, mining practices. We're really going to focus on circularity today. So circularity here means designing products such that they can be repaired, reused, and or recycled. This is especially important for battery power technologies, given the maturity and success of battery recycling. And interestingly, while there are so many amazing companies working on novel and advanced ways to do better battery recycling, a lot of the challenges, especially at the consumer product level, is actually about collection and the economics. So it starts to mimic a little bit more of what we're seeing in terms of plastics recycling, in terms of where those key barriers for consumers. So again, collection and those associated economics are the biggest barriers for battery recycling. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of how folks are engaging with each of these. So when we think about all these things, to be able to recycle your batteries and to make sure that folks can actually collect them, the product needs to be designed for circularity. So it has to be designed such that batteries can be safely removed and recycled by end of life. It could be by the consumer, it could be by folks with a more technical understanding that are more capable of doing those things. But what we're seeing is examples of these are starting to emerge. The battery packs used in the Kia EVs seem to have been designed to enable repairability, which is really great. and a really important step towards that circular goal that we're all working towards. Next, once you've removed the battery, you need to be able to actually access that recycling infrastructure and collection. Currently, there's about 750 electronic recyclers in the US, although 7 states have none. Collection and the associated consumer education really is key. The EPA is currently convening workshop sessions to inform the development of best practices for state, tribal, and local governments to collect those end-of-life batteries for recycling. And DOE has provided funding to Staples and Batteries Plus to collect the batteries from consumers. So being able to go to you certainly can't put it in your recycling bin at your house. So being able to go to what is hopefully your closest Staples or Battery Plus is an opportunity for it to decrease the barriers for consumer recycling. Last, companies have been taking more and more direct action through partnerships to help ensure that the batteries from their products are in fact recycled. For example, companies like Still and other e-bike companies are working through the program, have partnered with Call to Recycle to ensure that their batteries are in fact recycled. For example, those e-bike companies have put together a program called People for Bikes that will help collect batteries from e-bikes and make sure that they get recycled. On the Still case, they voluntarily fund participation in Call to Recycle's rechargeable battery program to make certain that every battery sold in the US by them has in the US has a prepaid end-of-life solution. So again, looking at all the different facets of the barriers to make sure that collection is made easier and the consumer is able to play a role in that. Next slide, please. Okay, I know I've gone through a lot of information. I've said it many times. We have a lot that we wanted to talk about, and we did our best to shove it in, but we tend to think that using the STEEP framework hopefully helps make sense of this and tends to also facilitate the idea that you think through a lot of things. What we hope from this webinar is that this framework, the STEEP framework, can help you think through all those interconnected social, technological, environmental, economic, and political drivers and barriers, and that we've been able to provide you with a little bit of new information as well as maybe highlight some areas for you to keep your eyes on. We really want to challenge you all now to kind of see if you can accelerate your electrification electrification initiatives in a thoughtful and informed way. Please go home, think about your STEEP framework and see where you already have knowledge of your products and think about where there's gaps and kind of make a plan to understand what you need to know and how that can help accelerate your strategy. Again, feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A chat and we'll certainly do our best to answer them. And thank you so much for listening.
All right, Taylor, thank you so much for, excuse me, for walking us through a lot of different types of information and showing how that can be incorporated into a, utilizing a STEEP framework, how that can all be kind of rolled together and give a view of where things are and where things are headed related to electrification. We're going to take the last 10 minutes we have here to answer some questions that have been shared with us. And so, Taylor, let's start with one that that feels very timely, given all that's been taking place over the last week here in the U.S. with elections. What do you anticipate the impact of the election might be on electrification in terms of incentives or investments or consumer adoption? What are you seeing as early signs and signals about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question, right? And I think we're all watching this and trying to understand its implications. And we're definitely grappling with it in real time and with any kind of new announcements that are coming out. So with that being said, here's a couple of things that we're keeping our eyes on. Certainly not exhaustive, but maybe a good place to start. So we're really watching the IRA tax incentives for EVs. We know that the Trump campaign has spoken out against EVs for some time, leading many to think that it could be on the chopping block soon. However, we're seeing kind of counter signals to that, such as 18 Republican representatives, including from states like Georgia, who benefited from battery factories to power EVs. They wrote a letter back in August asking Speaker Johnson not to touch the IRA. So we're starting to see a little bit more nuance about the IRA and the interplay between electrification, those products, and economic development, workforce. All those things are starting to come to play. I think will really be tested as we see what happens. So that's kind of what we're watching there. Certainly, Elon Musk has been named as part of the transition, at least the transition team as part of the what's going forward. So we'll see how he plays a role in EVs, if at all, as well. So again, something else we're watching. Another thing that we're seeing is that the IRA tax credits for energy efficiency are also being seen as high risk for getting cut. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that. The next piece is tariffs. So we're watching tariffs. Lots of conversations about tariffs on both sides of the aisle. So it's not a surprise that it would be perhaps mentioned today. But putting tariffs on imported batteries from China, of course, could drive up the prices of goods, given that the vast majority of batteries in the US, it's about 80%, are coming from China. So if we see that, it could accelerate more domestic manufacturing of batteries, although those are a bit earlier stage. So there is a potential that in the short term, battery prices go up or maybe longer. It kind of depends on how all these pieces work together. The other thing to think about is this is really all at the national level, but as I kind of mentioned before, and I want to really emphasize here, a lot of what's happening for electrification and especially for consumer incentives, a lot of that is happening at the state or regional level. So states are looking at this, regional at the utility scale is looking at this. They are very, many areas are driven to electrify for a lot of variety of reasons, everything from sustainability, global warming to energy resiliency. Given that a lot of those are set already, we kind of don't expect those to change too much. That being said, we will certainly see what happens.
A lot of moving parts
Yeah.
to monitor there. Yes, thank you for thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. Um, Another question that came to us ahead of time. I think a lot of people want to look at the automotive EV space as like a leading indicator because it's maybe been around the longest, or maybe it's furthest into that innovation diffusion curve that you showed earlier. So to what extent do you think the automotive EV space can serve as a leading indicator for consumer adoption, particularly in home electrification kind of products? Love to
Yeah.
hear your thoughts on that, as well as what are you seeing or interpreting from that space at the moment?
Definitely. Yeah. And I mean, this is an important one. We see headlines. I mean, there was a ton of headlines, or a couple of months ago, earlier this year, about EVs are not doing very well. And then we're kind of seeing things picking up. And so there's been just a lot of news and kind of conversation about this. So it's certainly something we're watching too. So I think adoption can give you a lot of information, but you really need to know what you're looking for. As a blanket whole, I think it can kind of give you general ideas, but it's going to be so integrated with the economy, as well as people's interest in buying EVs. All of these things matter. Their favorite car maker model, did that come out with an EV? Like those are all the things that are kind of at that macro level that are important, but it can be kind of hard to pull specific trends to your product from that. So what we like to do is think a little bit more about like what are your customer segments and what vehicles or vehicle types are they more likely to buy? Are they looking, do you think that your customer base is more likely to buy a Tesla or a Ford F-150 or a Nissan Leaf, right? Those are all very different types of folks that tend to buy those cars. So when you dig down a little bit deeper and to start looking at kind of specific makes and models, we think that those can be much more useful to look at. And they also have very significantly different adoption rates and trends. So in the beginning of the year, when there was a lot of conversation about EVs aren't doing that well, a lot of it was driven by Tesla. Not as many people were buying Teslas, but the other makes and models were actually being sold. Their adoption rates were increasing quite significantly. So it kind of depends on who you think are going to buy it. But that's kind of how we like to think about it, is like get to the weeds as much as you can, because that's really where you can start making those better parallels.
That makes a lot of sense. You touched on battery technology, so that we've got a battery technology follow-up question. You did a nice job of like quickly summarizing the four kind of leading battery examples that are in play at the moment. What are you seeing out beyond that? What are some other emerging battery technologies that you're watching, and what do you see as some of the advantages of those maybe slightly further out, but hopeful technologies in the works?
Yes, well, I will fully show my cards and you will tell what I did my PhD and postdoc on because that is where my biases lie. But I just have really liked these technologies, so I'm going to use this opportunity to highlight them. I'm in no way attached to any of these, but um, one of the things that I think is really interesting is this kind of silicon-coated lithium-ion batteries that this company Forge
Mhm.
Nano is working on. I think what's really novel about and thoughtful about what they're doing is they're really leveraging the like know-how and manufacturing scale of lithium-ion batteries, which are, widely used. But they're doing very novel ways of processing and using chemistry to increase the safety and durability of those by adding this really thin layer of silicon on kind of the cathodes. So that's kind of the space I like to look at is like what's leveraging what exists today, but doing it in a thoughtful way to kind of increase the performance in one way or another of the battery. Um, Ford Nano, for example, has had a series of announcements around their planned 1 gigawatt hour factory in North Carolina that is expected to be operational roughly in 2026, as well as investments from GM. So it's not mm, really, it's not in the lab, but I think it's something that I'm definitely watching and really interested to see kind of who picks that up and where it gets used. Um, we are running low on time, and I think we have one more question. So I'm going to run through the last parts real quick. Okay, true
Sure.
bias. I did a lot of nanoparticle research, so I am biased towards where nanoparticles can be used. But silicon nanoparticles have been used in really interesting spaces. They're enabling fast charging in those silicon batteries. Companies like StoreDot are really working on this. So that's an area I'm always watching, is not only the chemistry, but the morphology and how can that be unlocking new areas. I think we'll leave it at those two for now, but there's so many more. We could talk
Right.
forever about this.
Yeah. Could be a whole nother webinar.
Yeah.
Last question. Then, to what extent do you think other trends that are happening in the consumer space, smart home, Internet of Things, automation, robotics, how and where do you see those aligning with home electrification?
Yeah, that is a good question. Yeah, I think if we kind of devolve ourselves from battery powered technologies a little bit, we think a little bit more broadly around home electrification. There's so many exciting things happening, and batteries, of course, play a role, but I'll start at the high level and kind of work backwards. So when we think about Internet of Things and smart homes, really that idea that like all of your appliances are connected to the internet and therefore can do and work in novel ways is pretty cool. The big thing that I think about in this space is how when you do that, you can start to think about when your home appliances actually run. Like if you want to start your washer and dryer to run overnight, what at what time is it running can actually have a significant impact on the carbon footprint of your house. So you can start to time those with when the energy that your house is getting is the cleanest. And I think that can be super exciting. That also leads into this idea of your home as basically like a backup battery for the grid. These are called virtual power plants and are happening. They're happening now. They're insane. I think they're so cool. So I'm just going to co-op this question over to those. But what we are seeing is companies in more the consumer product space, such as Google with their Google Nest, as well as Tesla with their EVs and Powerwalls, are starting to play a role in kind of fine-tuning when things are being charged, what temperature your house is, all those things, such that you can help the grid be cleaner, which is
Mhm.
really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. Shane, would you pull up the last slide for us here, and we'll wrap things up. Taylor, thanks for fielding those questions, and thank you to everybody for spending time with us this afternoon, digging into various facets of electrification and how to think about that for consumer products. We hope you found this to be an insightful time together. We're dedicated to driving innovation that shapes a better future, and certainly the work that we're doing in electrification feels like it really leans into that. We'd love to continue this conversation with you, and so I hope that you will reach out to Taylor, reach out to me. We'd love to hear about where you are in that electrification journey. What are you working on now? Where do you see the challenges to this? So let's continue that conversation. We look forward to hearing from you. We'd also love your feedback on this session overall. This is something fairly new for us. We're interested in seeing like what the value of these types of engagements can be for you, our audience. So as you're signing off today, a quick survey will flash up. We hope that you'll take a couple moments to complete that. And to entice you to do that, there will be a drawing from those who complete the survey. There'll be a $50 Amazon gift card that will be randomly drawn. So hope you'll take a couple minutes and do that. again, thank you all for being with us. We really appreciate your time and attention and great questions, and just wish you all a great rest of the day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.